Did we start the third day yesterday?
No.
Yeah.
Right here.
It
It's early.
Yeah.
Very early.
Alright, this is the third day, July 3rd, 1863, Battle of Gettysburg.
At approximately 4:30 in the morning on July 3rd, the Union Army preemptively planned. Union cannons reignited the battle, firing at Confederate troops positioned on Culp's Hill. The bloodletting lasted for more than 7 hours, as both sides kept up an almost constant spectacle of cannon and musket fire. Approaching the last hour of fighting, the exhausted Confederates launched their final assault. Confederate forces attempted a third and final attack on Culp's Hill. The Unions had pushed the Union line into the northern earthworks. After nearly 7 hours of fighting on some of the toughest terrain on the battlefield, the Confederates had been forced to relinquish much of the ground they had captured the previous evening. By noon, the sounds of battle from the area of Culp's Hill had faded away. Lee knew that his plan for a coordinated attack was no longer possible. He would have to come up with a new strategy for the final day of battle. That strategy would become known to the world as Pickett's Charge. The earlier than expected fighting on Culp's Hill had prevented Lee from delivering a coordinated attack. But Lee was undeterred in his desire to strike a blow at his enemy. Believing that the Federals were now weakest in the center, he ordered a frontal assault. The plan called for parts of 4 divisions to march across the open fields in front of Cemetery Ridge and converge on the area around a small clump of trees. Lee's last fresh division of soldiers from Virginia would lead the way, commanded by a man named General George Pickett. Lee knew, however, that his men would be exposed to a devastating barrage of Union artillery as they marched for nearly a mile across the open ground. To aid his men, Lee ordered a massive cannonade, the likes of which had never been seen before in the Civil War, to neutralize the Union defenders. At 1:07 p.m., nearly 150 Confederate cannons roared into action. When the Union gun crews responded, the sound was deafening.
See, the Confederate cannons are down here. Actually, there's some trees in here that kind of block the view. And they're firing up here. It's the Confederate cannons firing.
As he reaches for a captured Union cannon. Pickett's charge was one of the greatest charges in military history, and it ended in utter disaster for the Confederates. The losses were staggering. Half of Pickett's Pickett's division was dead, wounded, or prisoners of war. The loss of leaders was also painful. All of Pickett's 15 regimental commanders who participated in the assault were killed or wounded in the span of a single hour. And so the bloodiest battle on North American soil came to a close. By the time it was all over, the Union Army had lost approximately 23,000 troops. The Confederates somewhere around 28,000. The Confederacy had reached its high water mark on the blood-stained ground of Cemetery Ridge in a small section of ground known as the Angle. Lee's army had suffered too many casualties to ever mount another major offensive onto northern soil. The remaining 2 years of the war would be a defensive struggle for the South, finally ending at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9, 1865.
We can maybe look at a couple of things on here. There's a lot of information. Let's take a look at the armies. This is how they are divided up. So both of them have army. It just defines what a corps is, infantry corps, division, infantry division. They each have cavalry, artillery. This is an infantry brigade. It's made up of several regiments, which are the lowest. This is the lowest number of people. Weapons. I find that interesting. Okay, look at the different weapons that are used there. The 1842 musket, target rifle, Enfield rifle, Colt. This is a very popular cannon, the Napoleon. The Parrott rifle cannon is another one that was used a lot. Have you ever seen somebody fire a musket using the buck and ball cartridge or the round ball cartridge? You've seen anybody do that? In the War for Independence, most of the time you had a powder horn and you had to pour the powder into the end of the musket. Put the cap back on that. Shove that down, pull that out. Put the ball in. It's just a long process. Well, they came up with, they streamlined it by putting the gunpowder and the musket ball together in a package. So you just put the whole thing in at once. But your hands are occupied trying to get your gun loaded and everything. And so the best way to open up one of these paper cartridges is with your teeth. So just grab it, open up with your teeth, and shove it down. Well, because there's a lot of gunpowder, you're dealing with in that cartridge. Men during a battle would have gunpowder all over their face, which is not necessarily a good thing. So that was one of the things that happened as a result of tearing it apart with your teeth. Okay, we'll look at cavalry.
Senior leaders on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line relied heavily on the cavalry to provide crucial intelligence regarding their enemy's movement, strength, composition, and other clues that might guide the deployment of their forces. The cavalry was also used to conduct deep raids into enemy territory for the purpose of disrupting supply routes.
All right. That's all we probably need to look at. Oh, it's the quiz. How you doing the quiz?
Hall of Fame.
There was some people who did this before.
Oh, Jillian.
All right, roll against the guy. Ready?
Caleb. I nominate Caleb.
The Americans will be the girls.
Killers.
Seriously?
Girls.
Should put sophomore girls footy next to
Oh, I think I used a keyboard. Never mind. That's gonna be too hard to do with them. I have to do both sides at the same time.
Weird animation.
Hey!
Wait, look for him.
Recording on the corner. What do you mean?
All right, so what are the dates on which the Battle of Gettysburg takes place?
What?
Like
One, two,
first, second, and third, right? Now, remember one of the reasons why Lee invades the North, several, I think we had 3, maybe 4 reasons, but one of them is to try to draw Grant away from Vicksburg, because what's Grant doing at that particular time?
Under Vicksburg.
What?
Bombarding Vicksburg?
He's what?
Like attacking Vicksburg?
Yeah, but what specifically is he doing?
Taking
There's a
it to the back.
siege. There's a siege around Vicksburg, so people, the supplies, no supplies are getting in. Vicksburg is in a terrible position. I mentioned before, they were reduced to eating horses, dogs, cats, even rats, because they had no more food. Well, that's still going on. And we come back then to Vicksburg. If you go on the west side of your notes, we will continue with the fall of Vicksburg. And interesting that it's the very next day. Now, they don't know what's going on that many miles away, but the very next day after Lee loses the Battle of Gettysburg, Vicksburg surrenders on July 4th, 1863, leaving the Mississippi River entirely in Union hands. I have some pictures there. Are we going to do first? Okay, we'll come back. Let's do these first. This is looking at prisoners during the war. Over 32,000 Union soldiers were held at Andersonville. This is the most famous of the prison camps. Built for about, I think, 5,000 to 10,000, and yet there were many more come in there. There was a stream that ran through the camp, providing water, but that was also where they dumped their waste. So terrible, terrible conditions there. But a place from which the commander of that camp offered to send Union soldiers back, just let them come back to the Union lines, and Secretary Seward would not agree to it. In fact, they even had some soldiers on the way there, and he turned them back. So he wasn't concerned about the welfare of the soldiers. He wanted to tax the resources of the South to take care of them, and they couldn't. People will point out how bad Andersonville was, and it was. But the rate of death for the prisoners of war in Andersonville was the exact same rate as the guards at Andersonville. So they weren't being treated any more poorly than the Confederate soldiers who were guarding. They just didn't have food. They didn't have the resources. And the Union wouldn't allow them to better the lives of the soldiers they had there. Meanwhile, and there's another prison, a tobacco warehouse where officers were kept. Again, not very good either. Confederate prisoners were confined to Camp Douglas in Illinois, and it was an awful place too. The walls were very thin. These Confederate soldiers, of course, living in the South, were not used to the harsh Chicago winters. There was a time when fire broke out and burned a lot of the buildings. There were churches that offered to come in and bring food or medical supplies to the soldiers that were there, and the Union Army wouldn't let them do it. They wanted them to suffer, I guess. So Andersonville is what you always hear about, but the Union prisoner of war camp was pretty bad too, intentionally. The Confederacy didn't have any choice here. Like I said, they tried to get rid of prisoners, and the Union wouldn't take them. Here, it was by choice. The Union had the resources to take care of them and refused. What happened to people that were wounded? Of an estimated 584,000 soldiers wounded during the war. Of this number, over 80,000 died. So, it's a pretty high percentage. If you're wounded, you're going to die. Here's a Union ambulance corps. This is an ambulance, a wagon that was sent out on the battlefield. One ambulance for every 150 men. Here's a medical tent set up near the battlefield to take care of the wounded. And much of the time, there are people that were taking care of them that maybe didn't have medical background. You have women like Clara Barton, who served on the battlefield. I read where she was so close to the battlefield that on one occasion when she was taking care of a wounded soldier, a bullet came through and went right through, I think it was maybe it was her sleeve, somewhere on her clothing. So it was a dangerous situation. Here is people who've had limbs cut off. Most wounded went through surgery fully conscious, maybe a little morphine when available to deaden the pain. And I think we've talked before about when you get the kind of wound, especially from a musket ball, if it goes through, it totally takes out the bone. If it hits the bone, let's say the bone of your arm here, where it goes through, there's going to be a gap between this bone, part of the bone, and that part of the bone. It doesn't just break it, it shatters it, takes it totally out. So there's nothing you can do except cut off that part of the arm. Otherwise, gangrene will set in and they'll go to the heart and kill the person. So that happened, all the appendages. So the quickest method for taking care of wounded was to cut off whatever it was that got shot. They knew too on the battlefield if they got shot in the stomach, there was nothing they could do. If a musket ball came into their stomach area, they were going to die. There's no doubt. There's nothing that can be done about it. And so often, when men are on the battlefield, if they felt something, they would quickly open up their coat to see if they got shot in the stomach or not, because they knew if they did that they were going to die right there. But a lot of amputees outside the tent, or even in the tent where the surgeon is cutting, there would be stacks of limbs. There's no time to even dispose of them. It's one after another. Next, okay, cut off that one. Okay, next, cut off that arm. Next, cut off that leg, and just keep throwing them in a pile. And like it says here, most of the time without any anesthetic. These guys are awake. Now, at the same time, there is a lack of unification in the North for the war. Initially, the North attempted to raise a volunteer army, but eventually instituted a draft where they drafted men into the army. The thing is that in both places, if you had money, you could pay somebody else to take your place, which you can't do today if the draft were reinstated. So there were men that were professional draft, what would you call it, fulfillers, I don't know. Let's say Nate doesn't mind going to war, and he sees a way of making money, and Devin, he's been drafted, but he doesn't want to go. So Devin pays Nate to take his place. So he takes Nate takes Devin's name even, and goes in as Devin into the Army and serves his time. So if he gets killed in battle, it's Devon's name that comes up, because he's serving his spot. Well, sometimes there were unscrupulous people doing what Nate was doing, and he would take the money from Devon to serve, but then not show up. And then he would go and Caleb would pay him to serve, and he would get paid for that and not show up. So there were some people that were getting paid to take another's place in the draft that didn't actually do it. But there were many who did. And then their time of enlistment was up, and they would go. Somebody else would pay them to go. Tough way to make a living. And the Copperheads were a Democratic Party members in the North who were against the war, and they incited a riot in New York City to protest the draft. There also was a riot by Irish because they felt they were being unfairly drafted more than other people. There were a number of draft riots, especially in New York City. Here's a drawing that someone made of the New York draft riots. So there was a lot of negative feelings about the war among many Northerners, which is why some of them called it Mr. Lincoln's War. They saw it was all Lincoln. It's nothing to do with us. Okay, so here we come to the fall of Vicksburg then, on July 4th. This is an illustration from the 1863 Harper's Weekly newspaper, and it's an illustration of the surrender of Vicksburg in the Civil War. The upper image is captioned, "The Surrender of Vicksburg, the rebels marching out and stacking their arms." You can see it, but you see cavalry over here. Here's the soldiers. Here are the soldiers coming out, stacking up their arms. The lower image is captioned, "The Surrender of Vicksburg, view of the city from the riverbank, showing part of the river batteries." So here you can see cannon. So Vicksburg surrendered on July 4th. The surrender deeply affected the residents of Vicksburg for many years. Because it fell on July 4th, the people of Vicksburg did not celebrate Independence Day again until the end of World War II, 1945. So about almost 80 years, or over 80 years, they did not celebrate Independence Day because that's the same date on which they surrendered. All right, any questions about Vicksburg? All right, let's go on to the next part of the campaign. I mean, after this, it's all downhill. Gettysburg is called the turning point of the war because after that, all the Confederacy can do is just go on defense and hope something happens. But they really have no more hope after this. And in the fall of Vicksburg, Gettysburg and Vicksburg in the same week. Those are major blows against the Confederacy. And so after this, it's just a matter of individual battles that kind of bring the whole thing to a conclusion. And one area in which there are battles is in the Kentucky-Tennessee area. I just want to briefly mention some battles there because they are, remember, they are important. So this is considered in the West also. So after Vicksburg, we have the Kentucky-Tennessee campaign. The first battle that we want to cover there. Now we've been in Kentucky, Tennessee before, so this is kind of a continuation. But Chickamauga was a battle in which there are things to be remembered. Bragg from the Confederates attacked the Union forces led by Rosecrans there, and in 2 days shattered him. So this was a major Confederate victory, but even then, there was little hope that the Confederacy could hold out, as you can kind of see. Chickamauga, they totally demoralized the Union forces. Rosecrans was replaced, and Bragg was the victor. Here's a painting of the Battle of Chickamauga in Georgia. This is an interesting photograph. Here's Johnny Clem on the right and his brother. This guy ran away from home and joined the Army at the age of 9. 9. At Chickamauga, he shot a Confederate colonel who demanded his surrender. He retired from the Army in 1916 with the rank of Major General. That's really something, isn't it? You join at 9, eventually became a Major General. A lot of interesting stories, a lot of interesting people in this war. All right, so following Chickamauga, there was a reorganization in the Union. George Thomas replaced Rosecrans in Chattanooga. And at that point, Grant, being successful in Vicksburg, was made the chief of all the Union forces in the West by Lincoln. And Grant broke the Chattanooga siege that had been set up there by the Confederacy. By the way, there were many who were against Grant having not only that position, but any position. At one point, some of his detractors said to President Lincoln, pointed out to Lincoln how much Grant drank. Now, Grant did drink a lot, but not when he was engaged in military operations. He only drank when he was bored. So, at Siege of Vicksburg, if there was nothing to do for a long time, you might find him sitting around drinking. But Lincoln was not too much disturbed by Grant's drinking because Grant was successful. And so when someone pointed out that Grant was drinking too much whiskey, Lincoln said, find out what brand he drinks and give it to all my generals. So he was more concerned with the results. And so Grant is put in charge of all of the Union forces now. So the Battle of Chattanooga takes place. Lookout Mountain, you can still see that there. It was easily captured by the Confederates, except for one area, Missionary Ridge, was still held by the Confederate Army. And the eventual victory on behalf of the Union took place because of a disobedience to orders. Some Union troops were ordered to go to capture a certain area, but then to stop at that place. And that was George Thomas's men. They were supposed to actually be creating a diversion by capturing some enemy rifle pits at the base of the ridge, and they did so, but they just spontaneously kept going and began to swarm up the ridge toward the main Confederate positions and force them to retreat. So it was kind of a mistake, but they were victorious. Bragg's troops, the Confederates, then retreated into Georgia, and Bragg resigned, replaced by Joseph Johnston. Grant, as I said, had been promoted to the commander of all Union forces. After the decisive campaigns at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga in 1863, revivals became a regular feature of Union Army life. So up to this point, revivals have been taking place in the Confederate Army, but now Union soldiers start to have a spiritual impression. They start to be concerned about spiritual things. Now, it's in the context of all this that in November of that year, it is decided that there's so many dead soldiers at Gettysburg that they should set aside an area as a cemetery. And so they're going to dedicate this in November of 1863. And they call upon one of the greatest well-known speakers of the time, Edward Everett, to come and give the main address at the dedication of this ceremony. Almost as an afterthought, somebody says, shouldn't we invite the president? Well, you know, he wasn't too popular, but they said, I guess that would be the proper thing to do. And so Lincoln was invited to go there as well. And so he He goes and after Edward Everett speaks for approximately 2 hours, Lincoln gets up to give his address. There he was in his study writing it. Part of that address contained these lines: "And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Lincoln's address was so short that if you look at pictures taken at the time, the photographer, didn't have time to even get set up. And he doesn't get a picture until Lincoln's walking away from the podium. Edward Everett came up to Lincoln afterwards and said something to this effect: "You said more in 2 minutes than I said in 2 hours." It's considered one of the great speeches of American history. Well, tomorrow we'll begin looking at what's called the War in the Wilderness Campaign, and that is going to take us into 1864, and it'll be a sort of a downhill slide from there till the end of the war. The assignment I want you to work on for tomorrow is to read and highlight Milliken, Part 2, pages 3 to 6. So just read and highlight pages 3 to 6 in Milliken, Part 2. Any questions?